A few weeks ago, we were considering the Sandokai, the sutra, the identity of relative and absolute. You remember we were chanting it a little bit. Well, basically it's saying what the Heart Sutra is, that emptiness is form, form is emptiness, identity of absolute and relative, another way of saying emptiness and form. Well, afterwards, one of you was asking, didn't you give a teisho a year or two ago about the 5 different ways traditionally in Zen in which the absolute and relative are related? And I said, yes. What was the title of it? I have no idea. So I said, well, okay, well, why don't I do it again? Well, of course, you can't do it again. You don't step in the same river twice, as Zen and Heraclitus would say. I do remember that I used koans from Joshu, my favorite master, patriarch, to illustrate each one. And I'm not sure, I remember some of them, but I'm not sure which ones I used exactly. But you get a bonus this time. I'm using 2 for each one of the 5 of Joshu. You know. So let's do it. Now, what are we talking about to begin with? Tungshan and a number of others developed in China over the couple of centuries, actually, this notion of that the 5 ways are absolute, relative, the absolute in the relative in the absolute, and the relative and absolute kind of equal. Which kind of you think would correspond to some of the images in the Sandokai, like the box and the lid, pretty equal, or the 2 arrows meeting in midair, you know. But there are the nuances, you know, in your experience, not just conceptually, but in your experience you can have, you know, the absolute absolutely blow you away. But remember what the Sandokai says, if you experience the absolute, you're not yet enlightened. Right? But that's one way, or the relative. But of course, most people just experience the relative at all, and that's it. Well, they don't really experience the relative even. They just distracted 1,000 ways. But my point is that, you know, the nuance, the koans, you know, themselves, the nuance can change according to, you know, your own experience of the moment, you know, your own dispositions. So it's not cut and dry that this is, you know, these koans illustrate exactly one of the other of these. All right, let's be clear there. And for example, when you say absolute and the relative and the absolute, where is the emphasis? The relative and the absolute, is it emphasize the absolute or the relative? Well, I'm going to take the first term as being what's emphasized, the relative in the absolute, or the absolute in the relative. All right, so with those clarifications, let's look at the Memonkan and the Hekigan Roku, the Blue Cliff Record, for some illustrations. So we'll take the absolute first. That's kind of the clearest, maybe. Without doubt, and I said this in the first teisho, without doubt the most famous and the clearest emphasis on the absolute is Joshu's Mu, which is the first most famous koan of the Memonkan. You know, Joshu is asked, does the dog have Buddha nature? And rather than give, you know, any kind of graspable explanation or concept or coming down to that level, he just says, Mu! That's not a cow. It means no, you know. Mu Monkan, no gate. So Mu, that's it. That's the koan, and you know there's this commentary and all that. But well, that's just about as absolute as you can get. You know, you're not saying anything. You're not affirming anything. Even what conceptually within Buddhism you might be able to affirm. You know, everything has Buddha nature, so a dog has Buddha. No, Mu. That's it. You can't say anything. That's about as empty and as absolute as you can get. And people spend years on that koan. You know, people often begin with that koan in their koan study, which of course isn't exactly study. It's more about plunging into it and having the experience. So experiencing what the koan is about. Another well-known one, which actually goes with a previous koan by Nansen, who is Joshu's teacher. We won't go into that one. It's about Nansen killing a cat. Now, don't go crazy. He didn't really, almost certainly didn't actually kill a cat. But the monks were arguing about whether the cat, what is how to define the cat, etc. Arguing about the nature of the cat, similar to the first koan there. And Nansen just sliced it in two. Maybe a way of saying, you're killing the cat already by trying to argue about it. You're not getting the actual life. But there's a follow-up. Joshu, Nansen's student, Nansen told the previous story to Joshu, and Joshu took the sandals off his feet, and put them on his head, and walked away. And Nansen said, if you'd been there, the cat would have been saved. So what's this about, walking around with your sandals on your head? Well, the point is, again, you can't conceptualize reality, especially absolute reality, which Nansen usually emphasized. And likewise, you can't say, this is a sandal, this is a slipper, this is what it's supposed to be, this is what everybody considers it, this is what, everybody knows what this is, and the point is you don't. So he put his sandals on his head. Who's to say that's wrong? You got to get away from all your relative, absolute, so to speak, relative concepts, and enter. That's what clowns are for, really, to remind us, we don't know what we think we know so seriously. So those might illustrate the absolute. The relative. I did use this the last time, I remember. Famous story of Joshu. Now, Joshu is the name of the town where he's from. The masters are often known by the name of the town. And so this is Joshu's 4 gates. So a monk asked Joshu, what is Joshu? Are we talking about the town or about him or what? And he uses the metaphor and says Joshu is the east gate, the west gate, the north gate, and the south gate. So in other words, if you're completely open, you let anything in by any means. North gate, south gate, east gate, west gate. It's like the New Jerusalem. So anything can get in. That's about as relative as you can get. Anything and everything gets in there because you're not filtering, you're not judging. We'll get to that in a second, by the way. You're just letting everything come in, flowing and not grasping, So very, very relative, respecting the relative. A very similar one, almost identical actually, when you get down to it, is in number 52 in the Blue Cliff record, Joshu's stone bridge. So again, you're using a metaphor of the construction of the town. The stone bridge of Joshu, the monk said, is widely renowned, but I come here and all I find are little stones. So same kind of bring him down a notch. That's the way that Zen people always talk to each other. And Joshu said, well, you see the stones, but you don't see the stone bridge. The monk said, well, what is the stone bridge? Referring again to himself. And Joshu said, it lets donkeys cross and lets horses cross. In other words, it lets anything cross, whether lowly donkeys or lofty horses or anything. You don't judge what's lofty or what's lowly. You just let them cross. Again, very similar idea that the relative is given its full, dignity and full rights. Okay, so are we going to get the relative in the absolute? In other words, the emphasis is on the relative, but you sense there's something behind. So I'm using another very, very famous koan by which almost everybody's heard of Joshu's number 7 in the Monkan, wash your bowl. You know this one, right? you've been coming for a while, you better. So a monk asked Joshu, I've just entered the monastery, teach me. And Joshu asked, have you eaten your breakfast? Have you eaten your porridge, your oatmeal? Your rice porridge, actually, of course. Yes. Well, then wash your bowl. And with this, the monk gained insight. So the insight is just in living and doing your daily relative things, but in the midst of your relative things, wow, you perceive something deeper. Just by washing your bowl. So that's the relative and the absolute. Very similar one in the Blue Cliff record. And this is where you see the absolute, behind the relative and the relative, yielding to the relative here, very, very clearly in this one. A monk asked Joshu, so all the dharmas are reduced to oneness. There we are in the absolute, right? But, the monk asked, what is oneness reduced to? So where is the absolute going? If that has any sense at all. And Joshu said, well, when I was in Seishu, I made a hempen shirt and it weighed 7 pounds. So that's what oneness is reduced to. Your sweater. The absolute in the relative. Or the relative in the absolute. The relative is what the emphasis is on, but there's something more behind it. You've got oneness there, but it's right here in the relative, just like it's in the bowl you're washing after breakfast. So how about the absolute and the relative? That was the relative and the absolute. The relative standing out. Now we're going to get the absolute in the relative. Let's try this one. And again, you can argue about which is being emphasized here, but these are illustrations. So this is Joshu's most famous statement. Not necessarily his action or one of the statements he's most famous for. Joshu spoke to the assembly. It's case number 2 in the Blue Cliff record. The real way is not difficult. Just avoid picking and choosing. So whatever you're dealing with, in the relative sphere, you don't hold on to it. You don't judge it. We're back to that again. We mentioned about judging a minute ago. You just let it be, and the clarity arises, as it says. So in the relative there's the absolute. You're not emphasizing the relative. You're emphasizing something deeper than that. Maybe this is even clearer. This is where he mirrors the Buddha himself in the Buddha's enlightenment. And it begins actually with the same way. The monk asked Joshu, so the real way is not difficult. It just abhors picking and choosing, or choice and attachment, as it's translated here. Now, what are non-choice and non-attachment? So Joshu answers that by basically quoting the Buddha's own statement when he was enlightened. Remember what he said? As he beheld the morning star, I and all the great earth and all things simultaneously find the way. So everything has entered into this higher realm. And he says, I alone am holy throughout heaven and earth. And of course, it's not Joshu, North Gate, South Gate, East Gate, West Gate. Well, it is, but it's not. Saying, I am holy, any more than it's the Buddha saying, I am holy. Or I am enlightened. It's a whole new level of I here, which is one with heaven and earth. And it's like swallowed up, as the ego is swallowed up. So it's the absolute and the relative here again. I alone am holy throughout heaven and earth. The absolute and the relative. And finally, where the absolute and relative seem to be pretty much on equal footing. Again, that was, by the way, case 57 in the Blue-Cliff record. This is case 37 in the Mamonkan, Joshu's oak tree. This again is a very famous one. The monk asked Joshu, what is the meaning of Bodhidharma's coming to China? In other words, what's reality? What's the Buddha? Joshu said, the oak tree in the garden. Now you could say maybe this is the same thing like the hempen shirt or, the relative, but that's so pointed and so you just sense that the absolute and the relative are in perfect union there. Also like when the Buddha held up the flower, that would be another good example where the absolute and the relative are perfectly at one and where you can absolutely get it right then and there. So it seems to me that's an illustration of that. And of course the oak tree in the garden, I mean you're one with it as well. You're the oak tree in the garden. The Buddha's the oak tree in the garden. And maybe this is a little clearer, although in a sense more mysterious at the same time. This wonderful koan, number 41 in the Blue Cliff record, Joshu and the Great Death. The Great Death is the death of the ego, the death, the mystical death. It's not just Zen that speaks of that, right? All the traditions speak of that kind of dying. But listen to this. So it seems like it's the absolute, right? Well, look what he does with this. It's like the one we saw before where we spoke about oneness, but then it turned out to be more in the relative. Well, here it's more together. So Joshu asked Toshu, what if a man of the great death comes back to life again? So once you plunge into the absolute, how do you come back to life again? What does that even mean? Resurrect, and Tosu says, you should not go by night. Wait for the light of day. So in other words, you don't stay in the absolute. Whoever experiences the absolute, not yet enlightened, is not just the darkness and the death. Don't go just by night. That's not yet the whole thing. You got to get the relative in there with the absolute. Make it equal. So come back by day. Wash your bowl. Even as you're dead. Only wash it if you're dead. So I think that's be taken as a clear indication of absolute and relative together. Dying by day, or being dead by day. So now you're going to all go home and say, well, I know what 10 koans mean. Well, no. As I said, as I was implying earlier, studying koans doesn't mean studying koans. Koan study is not study in the sense of, I'm going to sit down and figure it out. It's experience. All right. None of those is the experience. They're a catalyst. They point you in the direction. They maybe are the catalyst. Yeah, they can be the flint that strikes the match or the fire. But it's the fire we need. So keep sitting.